Dopamine. How is the neurotransmitter dopamine produced? What is its function? How does the lack of dopamine relate to Parkinson's? And what drugs influence the dopamine pathways? Structure and production. Dopamine is a small molecule which acts as a neurotransmitter, specifically as an amine neurotransmitter, like norepinephrine and epinephrine. In fact, dopamine can change into norepinephrine and epinephrine through enzymatic processes. First, tyrosine is turned into L-DOPA by the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase. Then, L-DOPA is turned into dopamine by dopa decarboxylase. After that, dopamine is turned into norepinephrine by dopamine beta hydroxylase, and finally, another enzyme turns norepinephrine into epinephrine. This process of turning tyrosine into dopamine is limited by the levels of tyrosine hydroxylase in our bodies. This means that after a certain point, the conversion rate slows down. A way around this rate-limiting factor is the oral administration of L-DOPA. When L-DOPA is taken, the first step involving tyrosine hydroxylase is skipped, and there is no limiting factor. Function. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical messenger sent from one neuron to another. In order to be a neurotransmitter, there are a few qualifications a chemical must meet. These include 1. The chemical must be synthesized or present in a neuron. 2. The chemical must produce a signal in a target cell. And 3. There must be a way for the chemical to be removed after it's done its job. Lucky for dopamine, it has qualified to be labeled a full-blown neurotransmitter. In general, when neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, the messenger system may 1. Depolarize the postsynaptic membrane and have an excitatory action on the other neuron. 2. Hyperpolarize the postsynaptic membrane and have an inhibitory action on the other neuron. Or 3. Start another chemical reaction that will have an excitatory, inhibitory, or other cellular communication function on the postsynaptic cell. Neurotransmitters can also influence the neurons they came from by sending and receiving a cellular message through an autocrine system. Dopamine has a metaprotropic receptor on the postsynaptic cell. A metaprotropic receptor is an embedded membrane protein that has a binding site for the neurotransmitter, which is connected to a G protein. Metaprotropic receptors can either affect other receptors or cause a second messenger to influence other cellular processes. Once dopamine has done its job in the synapse, the dopamine transporter picks up the dopamine and brings it back to the presynaptic cell for later use. It's kind of like recycling. When dopamine is working in the brain, its main functions include coordinating movement, attention, learning, and reinforcing behaviors, specifically through reward systems. For example, a person who is addicted to gambling has a very active reward system. The more they gamble, the more dopamine is released. Excess and deprivation. Because dopamine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning it works to keep something from happening, having too much or too little can cause problems in the brain and throughout the body. If too much dopamine is produced, or it is not properly removed from the synapse, receptor cells become overstimulated or overwhelmed and fire continuously. Excessive amounts of dopamine in a region of the brain called the hippocampus have been linked to schizophrenia. Though the exact reason for this is unknown, it is known that the symptoms of schizophrenia can often be alleviated with medications that inhibit the production of dopamine. The effect of inadequate amounts of dopamine is better known. In the brain, there is a region called the basal ganglia, which is responsible for coordinating muscle movement. One of the ways that you are able to fine-tune and stop muscle movement is through the transmission of varying amounts of dopamine within the basal ganglia. When there is a lack of dopamine in this system, Parkinson's disease results. Parkinson's disease, or PD, is caused by the death of cells in the basal ganglia responsible for dopamine production. As the cells die, less and less dopamine is produced, which diminishes one's capacity to control movement. Once 80% of the dopamine-producing cells in the system have died, patients become symptomatic, meaning that they begin to show signs and feel the symptoms of PD. These symptoms include tremors, especially of the hands, trouble speaking, muscular tension and fatigue, and back and posture issues. Non-muscular issues associated with Parkinson's disease include dementia, amnesia, restlessness, fatigue, and depression. Medications for Parkinson's. One of the most common drugs used to treat PD, levodopa, works by replacing dopamine in the brain. However, it cannot do this directly. Instead, it introduces one of the precursors of dopamine, L-DOPA, like we talked about earlier. This is then turned into dopamine and can be used to complete the neural pathway. What have we learned about dopamine? Today you learned that dopamine is a neurotransmitter that the brain uses to control attention, muscle movement, learning, and reward systems. Dopamine is released by one neuron and received by another, which signals for an action to occur. Too much dopamine can cause schizophrenia, and too little can cause Parkinson's. And Parkinson's can be treated by introducing L-DOPA, a precursor to dopamine, into the body through medication.